Welcome back to this is episode 6 of the podcast. In previous episodes, we were looking at leveling up our communication skills, and we recognize that for a lot of the models that we have, and given that we are working with complex human beings, that there is a place that we need to begin. We're going to call it level 0. And it's a place where we could say that we're setting the conditions for success with all of the other nonviolent communication tools. So let's begin, Elsa, by just giving us a sort of a roadmap as to what we're going to be talking about over the next little while.
Yeah, I think it may sound like a cliche that level 0 is the foundation that needs to be there, that must be there in order to level up to more direct, challenging conversations, giving feedback. So I think we're spending a little bit more time there because, like we've discussed together in the past, about 80% of what we're doing in a professional context is this basic level of deep listening, staying curious. And there's so much besides just staying curious that's needed for that foundation to be built. And it's so key to ensure that it's built that I think we wanted to really dive a little bit more into that before we go into actioning what happens after that. So I think we were talking about a framework for putting level 0 into action itself. And we came up with noticing, naming, and challenging. Noticing being the first sub step within setting the conditions needed for nonviolent communication. I think we wanted to talk about if we think this action model can stand alone as something valid.
Well, yeah, and just to put the action model in context. So, with all of our courses that we teach, we are looking for individuals to make some changes and changes in how they act, behave, how they comport themselves. And so, the three parts of that is people need to learn how to notice what's around them, and thank you for bringing that out. And we need a framework to be able to name what we're seeing or noticing, and then, of course, with all our courses, we want people to challenge, to disrupt, to interrupt negative behavior, and to do so in a way that is non-violent, in a way that is effective. So again, anytime we talk about changing relationships, anytime we talk about managing conflict in a way that brings people together, we always want to come back to this three part. We need to be in a place where we're noticing. We need to be able to name what's happening, whether it's internally or externally. So we're going to look at that in more detail. And then I know that in subsequent lessons, subsequent programs, we're going to talk about candor, and we'll look at and label one aspect of candor, rot it. And then in subsequent sessions, we'll unpack some structure, what we could call some starting points to ensure that the concept of candor is profitable when we're in conflict with people, or profitable when we're working with challenging or difficult individuals, whether that individual is a boss, a coworker, or a client. So let's start in, if we could, with this framework for changing relationships, changing society, and for becoming a better coworker or managing conflict effectively. So let's talk about the first piece, the noticing.
Yeah, I think just a lot of leaders, like you said, it's profitable. The people may not have had the role models that they need to be the leader they want to be. And the first step towards doing that is actually a matter of, quietly noticing what's going on around, being more aware of your surroundings, the values people are sharing where they work, trying to get a sense of what kinds of conditions can make communication smooth and productive because we all work amongst other individuals. I think we can't assume that our style of communicating is going to work with everybody. So I think noticing has to be the first step, deep listening for setting those conditions for communication that is heard from the unique individuals around us. And leaders, above all, need to have this step in mind.
So let's again come back to a scenario. So the theory is powerful, this idea that we need to notice. We need to be able to be aware, not just the idea of driving to work and you don't remember the route, right? It's habits really that we have. We need to be able to break out of the habit of just simply going along to get along, right? It's where we begin to able to, and let's come back to that. Like, what conditions need to be set for me as an individual to notice oppression, to notice what's not working? What does that involve?
I think it involves having a sense of being invested in the people that you work around so that you care about their experiences. Because at the end of the day, that's going to affect you and your bottom line. So it's like building this understanding of what's important to the people around you. That's what comes to my mind is
I
just
like that.
trying to build some interest in the people around you because you're invested in
Mm.
their health and well-being.
Yeah, and I like those two ideas, right? We need to be invested, right? We're not just trying to get out of a situation. And
And
I
we are invested in a professional relationship if you're a leader.
100%. And I
Yeah.
also like the other part that you say, which is in order to notice, we need to actually be able to say to ourselves what is important, right? So noticing means seeing what's important. And I think that noticing also is built on just an understanding of our values, because if you're going to answer the question, am I seeing what's important? We need to have some values that allow us to do that.
Yeah. I mean, there's personal values, there's deep core values people have, and then there's organizational values. And sometimes that Venn diagram doesn't line up. And we want to get people subscribing to the values of an organization so that we can use those as a reference to come back to. Like the reason why we have this policy in place is because we value this. And if that person sees that as a value, if for some reason they weren't falling into, that policy as appropriately as they should be, then if they can see the value behind it, and we teach this in a lot of our courses, it's the idea of organizational values being the driver for how to communicate
Hmm.
feedback to a person and get them.
Yeah.
I keep wanting to say falling in line, but that's not what I mean.
No.
Meeting the expectations.
Yeah, meeting the expectations set out. But I always want to come back to this idea that with our action framework, noticing is really grounded on a key question, which is what's important, right? And we can look to what's important. Organizational values, the policies and procedures that are in place always speak to what's important in an organization. So let's go to the second part of that framework in the time remaining, which is the idea of naming. And I know that you've often talked about naming as being able to analyze as well as being able to label. It's not just labeling, but it's actually there's some analysis going on and some labeling. And so could you unpack the idea of naming a little bit?
Yeah, I think being able to do something about an issue you're experiencing,
Hmm.
you have to understand what that issue is. And I think a big part of that is just being able to talk about it. And if you don't have the language for categorizing or describing an issue, then you don't have the ability to change something. And you may just be more likely to avoid dealing with an issue because you don't have the language to talk about it. So it's about gaining language around an issue so that it can be analyzed and changed if necessary, adjusted, adapted, evolved, eliminated, whatever it might be. But I think that besides noticing, the next step is being able to talk about what that is, which involves needing a name for it.
Yeah, and I like the ladder of inference that we could layer onto this model, right? Where the first starting point is to actually just look at what is there without any judgment. And it's all about not labeling something as good or bad. And then the naming is where we bring an organized system that allows us to define when something is wrong, when something is good or bad.
Another foundation for this whole aspect of nonviolent communication is being aware of how your brain thinks.
Right. We're gonna end it there, and I know that we're gonna come back and we may revisit some of the ideas, the action framework, before we step into thinking about this idea of candor as a nonviolent method of communication. So we want to thank you for joining with us, and we hope to see you on the next podcast.